The Linux file system section, we're talking about how Linux stores files. And it's quite different from many other operating systems that you may be familiar with, like Windows. On Linux, first and foremost, everything on the system is considered a file. A file is really just a collection of bytes that are stored on a hard drive. And we have regular files on Linux systems like text files or ASCII text files, executables, things you are probably very familiar with. But then there's also other types of files. For instance, a directory is not typically considered a file, but on Linux it is technically a file. We also have things called device files, like character device files or block device files. And these file types represent actual hardware on the system, or they can represent hardware on the system, like a network socket, or even the actual hard drive itself is represented as a file on the operating system. And this may sound kind of confusing at the moment, but hopefully with time it may start to make sense as to why they're considered files and why everything on the system is considered a file. So everything on the system is a file, and a file is essentially just a collection of bytes stored on a hard drive. So a hard disk on the Linux file system, like any other operating system, can be separated into multiple different partitions. And these can be partitioned either physically or logically using logical volume management, which we'll talk about later on in the course. But each partition on the hard drive is formatted with a file system type. And this is something that's important to distinguish between a file system type and the actual file system itself, which includes all of the files that are stored on the computer. It's easy to get the two confused. So the main two file system types that we're going to be dealing with in this course is the XFS file system and ext4 file system. Now there's many other different types of file systems that you can use. You can even use Windows file system types such as NTFS or FAT32 if you wanted to format a partition with that file system type or structure. So once we put a file system type on a partition on a hard drive, it is then considered a file system. And the Linux file system is simply just a collection of multiple different file systems. And that may sound very confusing, but hopefully in a minute when I illustrate that, it may kind of make sense. For instance, on a Windows system, when you first boot up a computer, you get a new computer and you install the Windows operating system. If you only have one hard drive, you'll probably, if you look under Windows Explorer, you'll see that you have a C drive. And that'll be represented as C://. And so C:// is considered the root level of the file system. But if you were to plug in another hard drive into that computer, that hard drive is going to show up as a separate drive letter, which will essentially have its own separate root level file system. For instance, C:// and then maybe D:// will be another root file system. But in Linux, that's not the way it happens. In Linux, you can think of it as if you plugged in even 3 more hard drives into that system, all of the data or the files that are stored on those hard drives will still be accessed underneath C:/. There's only one root level file system. And the way that this happens is we basically create a directory within the original root level file system. We can create a directory anywhere we want, wherever we want, name it whatever we want. And when we plug in a new hard drive, we will mount that hard drive to a directory that already exists underneath the root level file system. And then to access the data that's on that new file system, we would just cd or change directories into the directory where we mounted it. So let me go ahead and illustrate this to kind of give you a little bit of a better idea of how this works. So in this scenario here, we have disk 1, which is going to be our primary hard disk. And then we're going to have an additional disk, disk 2, which we'll use for storage or something like that. And then we'll actually have a CD-ROM, and then even a USB drive here. And so depending on how many, assuming that we only have one partition on each one of these disks, just for simplicity, here we have a total of 4 different file systems, because each one of these devices is formatted with a file system type. In the case of Windows, it'll probably be formatted with an NTFS file system, but each one of these has an individual file system on it. Now, on Windows, disk 1 will probably show up as C:. Disk 2, if we were to plug disk 2 into this system, may show up as any drive letter, but we'll just say it's E. If we had a CD-ROM, that would probably then show up as D:. And then a USB, we'll just say that this shows up as F. And so we have 4 file systems on this Windows system, and the way that they're going to be displayed in Windows Explorer and the way that we access them, they show up as 4 individual root level file systems. So root level file systems that all start with a different drive letter. And this is where the difference is. So the same situation in Linux would look more like this. Disk 1 would be mounted to /, and that is our root level file system. And this is where it gets different. When we were to mount disk 2, that would actually be mounted. We could mount it anywhere we wanted to, but usually there's a top level directory called MNT, which is short for mount, where you can mount different disks. So we're just going to say that we mount this under /MNT. So under /MNT, we're going to create a directory called, say, storage. So there's a directory called MNT. And we're going to create another one called, another directory called storage underneath it. And we're actually going to mount the disk to this directory /MNT/storage. And this directory falls underneath the root level file system, where disk 1 is. So it's mounted inside of the root level file system, not in a separate file system like Windows does. So when we mount the CD, there's usually a top level directory called media. So let's just say we mounted it to /media. And then inside that directory, we're actually going to create our own directory called, let's just call it CD. Okay, so we mounted the CD there. And then the USB, let's just mount it underneath the /media directory as well. So media / and we'll just create a directory called USB. And we're going to mount that file system there. Now the difference here is that all of the Linux file system all fall under one root level file system called / or the root level. In Windows, we have 4 different root level file systems. They don't merge into one another. In Linux, it makes even an infinite amount of file systems seem like it appear that it's it's very seamless. It makes it appear as if it's one cohesive file system. And so that's where we talk about how it's easy to confuse the fact that each one of these hard drives or media types has a file system on it. Whether it's formatted with XFS or ext4 type file systems, they all have their own file system with their own file structure and individual files on them. But once they're all mounted to the Linux system, they are all mounted under the root level file system in one cohesive file system, which we refer to as the file system. And hopefully that kind of helps to illustrate the difference between the file system architecture and structure on Linux versus Windows that you may be more used to.